Good afternoon. I'm Steve Grundman. I am the MA and George Lund Fellow here at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. Our purpose this afternoon is to undertake a discussion with our guests to my left of the topic entitled Benghazi, Ukraine and Beyond. Can't get much more provocative than that in this moment in time. Applying American Power in the 21st Century. Speaking on this topic on this panel are the four beside me. John Hudson, staff writer for National Security at Foreign Policy. My colleague and boss, Barry Pavel, the director of the Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council. Zachary Keck, associate editor of The Diplomat. Jeff Lightfoot, actually he's not, is Zach? Excellent. Zachary Keck, associate editor of The Diplomat. Jeff Lightfoot, a friend and former colleague also from the Atlantic Council, but now who is a senior associate at the Jones Group International. And Stacy Pettyjohn, political scientist at the Rand Corporation. In a moment, I'll introduce John, and then I'm going to turn the proceedings over to him, who will moderate the rest of the proceedings. I was asked by Barry, I think, to introduce this panel because I think I was at the nub of the impetus for it, which was a phone call from the patron of my fellowship, George Lund, who had attended an event something like this. I even don't maybe conveniently remember exactly which one it was. And literally on his way back to the office, he called me up and said, "We need to talk." He said his sense was, and I can at best really paraphrase it, his sense was that a fairly conventional dialogue about defense policy and strategy was growing greater and greater at odds with the stuff on the front page of the paper, which we caption in the title of this, right? Crimea, Benghazi, not to mention Syria, et cetera. And so my slightly cheeky formulation of this, which is not George's, not even a paraphrase, by the way, is my thesis for what we're here to talk about is, does the defense policy, does the defense strategy as articulated, I suppose the current one in the United States, first in January 2012 in this document called Defense Strategic Guidance, and more or less reiterated in the recently published Quadrennial Defense Review, does the contemporary defense posture and strategy have any clothes? Whether relative to what is actually happening, that the actual manifestation of insecurity in the world today. So to address that, I think fairly provocative proposition or question, mere question, we have deliberately set out to get some fresh, mostly young voices, other than me and Barry, up on the stage, not least because I think they think more freshly and from a different perspective about these questions, maybe are more willing to see the lack of clothes than us old guys like me who have a hard time getting past our own blinders to see that maybe the defense strategy got no clothes. George, who could not be here today, is quite pleased that we're doing this nonetheless. And so that little narration sets up, I hope, sufficiently, what this panel is about and why we're doing it. That having been said, I'm just going to, as I said, introduce John Hudson briefly, and then I'm going to let him take it from there. I said already, John is a staff writer in National Security at Foreign Policy. He's also a blogger at The Cable, where he reports on U.S. foreign policy and national security issues. You may have seen him on MSNBC, BBC, C-SPAN, Fox News, among other things. And I also would point out that he is well suited to this task because he has done a thing or two in his life besides sit in a newsroom and wander around Washington. He covered the August war between Russia and Georgia, for example, from Tbilisi once upon a time. So, John, thank you very much for coming and doing duty as the moderator here. Take it away.
Thanks a lot, Steve. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the Atlantic Council setting this up with a great range of experts here to talk about the application of American power. That was a great way to, I think, open up the discussion, and let me just dig into this in introduce our panelists. We've got Barry Pavel, Vice President and Director of the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, he's a career member of the Senior Executive Service in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy for almost 18 years. We also have Jeff Lightfoot, Senior Associate, Jones Group International. He's the former Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center. Stacy Pettyjohn of the RAND Corporation. She's a political scientist whose primary research areas include military posture, internet freedom, American foreign policy in the Middle East, and terrorism studies. And Zachary Keck, Associate Editor of The Diplomat. He's also writes a monthly column for the National Interest, which is definitely worth checking out. You should include it on your RSS feed. And if anyone is tweeting about this under the hashtag AC Strategy, you can post any complaints or appraise of the amazing elucidating information that's coming out.
And moderation.
Yes, absolutely. Barry, I wanted to start with you, and I want to start with Ukraine. Last night, by John Kerry's own admission, Russia has failed to implement any aspect of the Geneva document that it signed last week to de-escalate the crisis in Ukraine. Currently, there are tens of thousands of Russian troops amassed at Ukraine's border. Moscow has made no visible effort to instruct pro-Russian mobs to vacate the premises of government buildings in Ukraine. And sources in New York tell us that this weekend there are UN diplomats being told to stay in this weekend for fears that there could be a crisis. That's an Atlantic Council exclusive right now. Anyway, despite all of this, there's been a lot of American activity in response to this. There's been speeches, there's been sanctions, there's been the threat of sanctions, there's been the mobilization of naval resources, and yet it hasn't seemed to change Putin's behavior or the trajectory of the crisis. This is a discussion about applying American power. Barry, what other aspects of American power do you think need to be used, applied in this situation?
Well, thanks a lot, John, and thanks everyone for being here. And I'm really thrilled to be the oldest person on a panel for the first time in a very long time. I intend to make that a habit, although I did freshen up on the way here so I could be fresh like the other voices. But thanks again for being here, all of you. I think that what we're seeing in Ukraine, what we're seeing in Syria, what we're seeing in Venezuela, I mean, my first proposition is the world is changing very quickly, and I don't think we've even changed the way we think about the world, the way we identify what's important, the way we develop strategy and policy, the way we make decisions in our government, and the partners and actors that we think are important. I think the world has already changed. I think disruption is the new normal, and I think we need to really start letting go of our World War II framework, and I'm happy to talk about that more, and starting to adjust to the era that we are already in that's going to get even more complex, even more surprising, and even more disruptive, to overuse a word. Now, to your specific question, I have to say I think that that what the Obama administration is doing up to this point is probably about right, and I'll tell you why I think that. I think if we, some have called for using far more aggressive military responses to deter Russian activity in eastern Ukraine. I think if we do that too much, too blatantly, too publicly, it plays to Putin's narrative, which strengthens his relationship with his base, which sustains him in power. I think our number one objective should be to destroy the cohesion between Putin and his elites and his cronies and divide them from the Russian people. We don't want to make the Russian people our enemy. That was a long time ago, and I don't want it to ever come back. I don't think it's in any of our interests. So I think the measures we take have to be very precise, and I think we now have the ability to be precise with both military and with economic sanctions. So I think sort of escalating to sectoral sanctions might seem like a good idea, but to the extent you start hurting the average Russian, they're going to be sitting there saying, wow, the U.S. really doesn't like Russia. This isn't about our illegitimate leader who steals elections and puts people in jail and kills people for no reason and doesn't give people human rights. This is about Russia. So I think everything we do should be calibrated to focus on how does this affect Putin and the elites, not how do we strangle Russia as a nation and how do we start another Cold War.
And that does seem to be the administration's focus in terms of creating a divide between Putin and the cronies. That's what the targeted asset freezes have seemed to do. Jeff, do you have any further thoughts on the application of power in this specific instance of Ukraine and Russia?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think what Barry says is really interesting, but I also think it's a little bit problematic. And first of all, because my understanding of the situation, I haven't been in Russia the last 6 months, is there's a pretty nefarious propaganda campaign that the United States could do the drop Hershey's candy, Hershey's Kisses into Moscow, and there would still be quite a bit of public support against anything the United States is going to do. And so I'm not sure that that's actually something that we can endeavor to be very successful in. And I almost more think that it's now time to reassure our allies and our base in Europe. And I think this is where American convening power and American leadership can make a difference. By the way, I should caveat by saying that I'm here in a personal capacity and don't speak for my company or anybody else. I should just put that out there. This is one of my first speaking engagements since leaving the Atlantic Council. That's probably prudent and responsible. But I think this is where the United States can get out and provide leadership. And I think that President Obama did the right thing in going to Europe a couple weeks ago and made some pretty strong statements. Kerry and Biden are both coming here to the Atlantic Council next week, and I think are going to give some strong statements as well. We've heard a lot about the energy picture as well. But I think why Ukraine is significant is that it's really punctured illusions that Russia is, at any point in time, under Putin, going to be moving into the West. There seemed to be this assumption since the end of the Cold War that sooner or later Russia was going to get there. There might have been some sort of post-Cold War hangover, but that it was just a matter of time before they would eventually join the Western community of nations. And I think even under George W. Bush, when NATO and then the European Union was enlarging, it was not seen as geopolitical competition, but that this was the right thing to do, and this is the way that history was marching, and eventually Russia would catch up to that. And I think those illusions are now gone, and we find ourselves with Putin very vigorously competing geopolitically with the West, and the West essentially not really pushing back. And so I think we need to be careful and not be too escalatory. So now is not the time to propose putting Georgia, Ukraine into NATO or anything like that. But I think that we can do more. I think we can be a little bit bolder in some of our military exercises that we're talking about. I think we can start to think about the energy picture in more of a long-range perspective. And I think, the president's going to be going back over to Europe, as I understand it, in June of this year for the D-Day celebrations. And I think it's another really good opportunity because this is not something where we can change that calculus between Putin and the elite, I think, on our own. It's going to require the Europeans, who have much more at stake economically. And that's going to require, I think, the United States to articulate what its vision is for Europe and for the transatlantic partnership a little bit more clearly and work really hard to get those allies on board.
Mm-hmm. Well, this sounds like a lot of ideas that the administration is already pursuing right now. It kind of, in contrast, some of the administration's strongest critics in Congress have called for those sectoral sanctions that you brought up, have called for larger shipments of weapons to Kiev. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch for. So that's one specific issue of applying U.S. power. I wanted to talk to you, Jeff, specifically because you've spent a lot of time thinking about the issue of overinvestment in specific aspects of foreign policy. And you've written about the idea that there are booms and busts in foreign policy thinking when it comes to certain strategies. You wrote a piece for Medium, I think, last year that discussed how in the Eisenhower era there was an overinvestment in nuclear weapons. In the post 9/11 era, an overinvestment and a boom and bubble in counterinsurgency. I wonder if you could discuss a little bit about what issues you think we might be overinvesting in now, what strategies we're overinvesting in now, and what things we should be investing more in.
Sure. And what really prompted my thinking on this was when the Snowden revelations came out, it really struck me, especially when you looked at some of the great reporting that Dana Priest did for the Washington Post about this buildup of this national security state post 9/11, and then I think the very quiet accumulation of capability by the NSA that seemed, I think, to a certain measure, because it was so classified, to be cost-free, that the United States could eavesdrop and spy I see a really good friend of mine who's German in the audience, who I talk to regularly about this issue. That blew up enormously in our face with strategic consequence, and I think that was really the bursting of a bubble in that sense. And we seem to overinvest in certain capabilities, sometimes because they seem to be cost-free. And I think for Eisenhower, nuclear weapons, it was about, well, this is cheaper than trying to balance out Soviet conventional dominance in Europe. So we overinvested, and that almost blew up in our face in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think, once again, there was a cool Obama way of war that we saw, and I think David Ignatius also wrote about this pretty well. There was something stealthy about sanctions, about Stuxnet and cyber attacks, drone attacks, things like that, that didn't require boots on the ground but allowed the US to sort of push towards achieving some of its security objectives. And I think that way of war may have blown up in our face. There isn't much appetite for the US to look at boots on the ground, and now I'm concerned that what looks comfortable to the Pentagon is air-sea battle and some sort of confrontation with China. And then the second area I think could be a bubble is cyber. And I see someone from the Atlantic Council cyber team here. A lot of people talk about cyber. I'm not convinced, myself included, that a lot of people really understand what it means. And I think there's a lot of money flowing into that realm. So my sense is that China and cyber are the two new areas of bubbles. Can we avoid this kind of outcome? I don't know. I think strategic surprise lends us in some ways to quickly surge money and investments into when we have a strategic surprise. If you look at the budget for JIDO and the counter IED, that they just got this rush of money that I would wonder how any bureaucracy could absorb in that period of time. So I think, and then sometimes congressional prerogatives might also help inflate some of these bubbles as well. So I think right now China and cyber are the two areas I would think might be growing bubbles.
Mm-hmm. And that issue of what are we spending too much money on, I think part of that discussion has to involve the issue of there are so many international crises around the world that are inspiring calls for American intervention around the world. And it brings up the issue of which crises can the United States afford to intervene in? Stacey, I wanted to ask you about this because I know you've looked into the Syria issue pretty closely. Last year, Barry wrote a piece in Foreign Policy magazine advocating for U.S. military intervention in Syria. And it's a great magazine, by the way. It's a good venue to be expressing your thoughts. One of the things that you said was important in this discussion about a U.S. intervention and in advocating for it was how geopolitical events are interconnected and that the allies and enemies of the United States are watching when the U.S. doesn't show a particular amount of resolve to deal with tricky national security issues. I just wanted to ask you, Stacey, if you believe that logic is accurate, that in a situation X, if America doesn't evolve, it could have a dangerous effect on situation Y.
So I want to preface this by saying I don't think that the military instrument is necessarily the best one or the one that should be employed in every situation, and that has actually gotten us into problems in the past. We have this wonderful military tool, and we feel like we can apply it everywhere, and clearly it doesn't solve all of the problems. You can look at Libya. We deposed Gaddafi, but there's still manifold problems in Libya, including terrorism that the United States is going to have to deal with the repercussions with, as well as the Libyans. That being said, I do think that there is a level of interconnection between commitments and following through on your promises, and that generally it's a really bad policy if you say you're going to do something, draw an explicit red line, then not do it. And I don't think that is the way that any government should be creating policy, and I do think it can harm the U.S. and has hurt its credibility in places like Asia and the Middle East, where countries look and wonder whether the United States will actually follow through and stand by their security guarantees in the future. There's been a lot of political science research on this that actually calls into question whether credibility matters. And it's done by very good researchers, but they tend to focus on crises. And I think that you have to look at credibility more broadly than that and consider during peacetime as well, because that's when allies are going to go and invest in different capabilities like nuclear weapons or make decisions whether they're going to bandwagon or balance with the United States or with potential adversaries. So I do think there is a level of interconnectedness.
And do you think it's worth it, even though the credibility issue is important in establishing that when the President of the United States draws a red line, that means something? On the other hand, it has led to an agreement, a breakthrough agreement with the Assad regime. This week, it was announced by the OPCW that more than 90% of Assad's declared stockpiles have been removed or destroyed amidst fresh allegations that he's using chlorine against his own people. Barry, do you still have the same amount of confidence that it was right to advocate for a military intervention and airstrikes, looking back and seeing some of the progress that's happened since then in the deal, but yet also seeing that Syria continues to be the greatest humanitarian catastrophe and a national security threat for the United States?
Yeah, and I think we've sort of forgotten that there are more options than drone strikes, cyber offensive strikes, and all-out 100,000 troop invasions. I mean, there are middle uses of force for very discrete objectives that have been very successful even in the recent past. These can range from even humanitarian operations in very difficult and sometimes hostile environments to sustained air campaigns, as was conducted over Kosovo, and I would argue even the air campaign over Libya was a very discreet, and I would argue successful for the purposes of that campaign, successful use of force. There just wasn't any follow-through, which is an integral part, or should be an integral part, of any such military operation. So I think what I worry the most about is that we have the most capable military in the history of the world, but it seems to be most comfortable when it's used for the most massive possible scenarios. And our political leaders, I think, have forgotten that there are some very discrete uses of force to defend and advance U.S. interests that don't necessarily have to get us entangled. Just because you fire a shot or fly a sortie over a country doesn't mean you own the entire country. And so I disagree with those who suggest that the military instrument is such a blunt instrument that those are the necessary outcomes of any such use. That said, I agree with Stacy that we have tended to overuse the military instrument. We have under-resourced our other instruments, including our diplomatic service, but a full range of other capabilities that our nation should wield to advance our interests, including a lot of private sector capabilities. But returning to your specific question, I think Syria is, I think every single day that goes by, as we're sitting here right now, there are new radicals being bred in Syria. The flow of foreign fighters into and out of Syria is, the last statistic I saw, double the peak of flows of foreign fighters at the height of Iraq. And so we could be sitting here next month, next year, in 4 years, wondering, how did this last terrorist attack happen? And one of the reasons it's happening is because Syria is metastasizing and proliferating extremism. And even moderate people in the Muslim world who I speak to when I travel to the region, who don't have a particular axe to grind with the United States, is asking me, why do you watch this humanitarian suffering when you go save the Filipinos or you go save the Haitians? Why do you let this happen? Why are you letting 125, 140,000 innocent Syrians die, but you help out other people when they're facing humanitarian hardship? So we are, the amount of alienation and radicalization that is happening every day because Syria is festering is very damaging, I think, ultimately to our core national security interests. And I'm very concerned about it.
Mm-hmm. And just that last part, was that a suggestion that with the radicalization and an influx in radicalization in Syria and the lack of a more robust engagement by the United States in that conflict, there could be retaliation against the United States for not engaging in a further interaction in Syria?
No, I'm just suggesting that those who are fence sitters, and look, we live in a world now where anybody anywhere can see what's going on anywhere else. The interconnectedness is unprecedented in human history. So every time we take an action or we don't take an action, people watch and they decide, what do I think about the United States? And these people now have more power to do things. We don't know who the next leader of Syria is. We don't know who the next leader. I mean, there's a lot of flux in the system, as I call this sort of the new age of people power. There's a lot of sentiment that has much more power than it used to have. And all I'm suggesting in this particular case is that people who were at best fence sitters or mildly pro-American, the average people in the Muslim world, some of them whom I speak to, are wondering why don't they care about us? Why aren't they saving people who are being killed when they have the tools to do so, and indeed have used those tools to save other people in very similar circumstances? Why aren't they lifting a finger?
Well, Zach, I have not been ignoring you over there, and I'm really glad that you're here because you've been focusing on an issue that is probably the most timely right now, given the President Obama's travel to Asia this week. I think it's worth discussing the Pentagon's 2015 budget request. Some analysts believe that the budgetary constraints soon to be brought on by that request will render the administration's pivot to Asia ineffective and uninfluential. And obviously the administration is making the case this week that that's not the case, that the pivot to Asia is real. Real American resources are being relocated into the area. What's your take on this? Do you buy the administration's argument that it's making to allies this week, we are moving and this is our focus?
Yeah, well, I think as far as a 2015 budget goes, I think that was in many ways a reformation of the Pentagon's commitment to the Asia pivot. I mean, when you see the trade-offs that were made, basically we're sacrificing near-term readiness in order to have enough funding for some of the modern, sophisticated systems, the F-35, the long-range strike bomber that we anticipate using against China's anti-access area denial strategy. So I think in a lot of ways, actually, the Pentagon was making choices geared towards we're going to make the pivot our priority over these other conflicts that we're talking about. So in that way, yes. But the question I would have is, is this necessarily the right strategy to have in the Asia Pacific right now? And the biggest problem seems to be China's salami slicing strategies. It's taken the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. It's challenging Japan on the Senkaku Islands, and it's challenging the Philippines in the Second Thomas Shoal. So if we have these, this strategy would call to counter the salami slicing strategy, we would need more quantity, even if they're less capable platforms. Whereas we're trading off quantity for quality to counter China's anti-access area denial. And then I finally worry that China's anti-access area denial might be, we feel that it's geared towards keeping us out of a conflict, say over if China invades Taiwan, keeping the U.S. out of the conflict by denying us access to the region. And I think that's probably part of it, but I also wonder if China is just content to have us push us back. If we, during peacetime, just are not operating in the Pacific at the same tempo because of China's anti-access area denial strategy, that changes the perception of the region of, U.S. decline and China's ascent. And even if we can gain access if we need to during a crisis, if there's not aircraft carriers operating in the Pacific during peacetime, that's going to be a change to the game. So I think we got to be careful about that too.
And Barry, would you like to weigh in on this at all in terms of a view of the pivot to Asia, its importance, and whether or not it's actually happening in a way that is going to be sufficient to U.S. allies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can quibble with the sort of the starkness of the priority assigned to Asia, and certainly how it was rolled out, and the word pivot, which implies nothing else is as important or comes close. I think it's right to say that the long-term center of international relations in the 21st century is going to be the Trans-Pacific space. I think that's correct. It's almost unassailable. With the dramatic shifts back to Asia of economic activity, no doubt security issues also will follow. They are following. There's an Asian arms race going on as we speak. Not talked about too much, but if you look at the trends, they're there. So I do think sort of the general emphasis on Asia is roughly right. When I was a Pentagon planner in 2001, we were, without saying it, we were pivoting to Asia. We saw this coming until we were attacked on 9/11 in the Pentagon. And so I think it's a bipartisan sense, and I think it's broadly right. But I also think it's overplayed. And looking at the Middle East, the source of an enormous range of threats to Europe, to the United States, to Asia, it's not stable. We have a lot of interests at stake, I think the suggestion that the Middle East will calm down enough so we can pivot to Asia is sort of preposterous. And so we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. I wouldn't have put it as starkly as the administration did. We have reduced military capacity now globally. So setting such stark priorities in a world of shock, surprises, and disruption, probably not the best idea in light of that framework, which again, I think our government strategic framework and thinking hasn't caught up to the world we're talking about today. The title, Benghazi, Ukraine, Syria. I mean, these are the things that are going to start to occupy us, and we need a new lens to be able to look at these and anticipate them.
Mm-hmm. Stacey, you were nodding your head as he was talking about the overemphasis on a pivot to Asia while there are severe problems in the Middle East. I know you've looked into the issue of alienating Gulf allies. I wonder if you could talk about that a little more.
Sure, I share many of Barry's concerns. I think that the pivot, the way that it was constructed, the way that it was rolled out in a very public fashion, making the announcement that this was a dramatic change in policy, when in fact it was largely a continuation of many policies before with some areas of change. And then the implementation has sort of made it very difficult for the United States to reassure its allies in Asia and the Middle East and Europe, for that matter, at the same time. It has raised expectations dramatically that the United States is going to completely focus on Asia and that it is going to devote more and more resources there. And in reality, the US is a global power. It's never going to focus only its attention on one region. So every time something happens somewhere else, people are like, oh, the US really isn't pivoting. Look, they have to deal with Ukraine or they have to deal with Syria. And that's inevitable. That's going to happen no matter what. At the same time, the pivot, because it's more of a gradual change, and I'm fully in favor of the idea behind it, it has raised concern, given the US's fiscal constraints, that they're going to actually be able to follow through over the long term, and that there's much real substance behind it. And that has led the administration to need to constantly be out there reaffirming and saying, yes, we're pivoting, we are rebalancing, this is real, and it has real substance, there's real military capabilities coming with it, which in turn exacerbates the fears of allies in other regions like the Persian Gulf, who are worried that the United States is going to abandon them. So I think the structure, the way that this whole issue has been framed and the policy has been implemented is flawed and makes it really difficult to succeed.
Ouch.
Can I just say, I think
Yeah, go ahead.
more to do sort of with the, I mean, when you look at what the administration said, yes, it came up with this like catchy catchphrase with the pivot, and the media can latch on. The media loves these like one little catchphrases like containment, surge, and so I think, so they caught on to this. They said we can sell this. The media, I'm saying, can sell this. Get some headlines from this. But when you look at what the administration said, the administration did not say we're going to like completely abandon everyone else. So I think a lot of it's the media expected there was going to be this huge change because they didn't really actually read what they were saying. They just heard this new catchword, they liked it, and so then they can write articles like, oh, the U.S. is supposed to be pivoting to Asia, but Ukraine happened. But the administration's been pretty clear, I would say, and that's going to be a gradual change. So we're just putting everyone on notice, which I think is important. I mean, it's important. There's a lot of different actors involved in U.S. foreign policy and allies, so it's important to defense contractors to say, if you want to be in the U.S. market, like when these counterinsurgency weapon systems, aren't more armored MVs or Humvees are not going to be what we're going to be buying in 10 years from now. You're going to need to invest in different sophisticated capabilities to overcome China's anti-exterior denial. It's important for the State Department and people looking to get into foreign policy to stop studying Arabic and start studying Mandarin. So I think the overall overselling of the pivot was mostly done because I'd say not so much what the administration was saying, but how it was conveyed through media and different actors.
As a member of the press, I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that we don't fully understand and explain complex geopolitical events.
Well, I should say I'm a member
just
too.
going to leave that there. Jeff?
Two things about the pivot, because we've talked about it quite a bit here from a military dimension. It would be really interesting if, unfortunately we don't deal, this is not the reality, but if President Obama had been able to come to agreement in Tokyo with the Japanese on some of these thorny issues concerning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I think that, what would the narrative be like in the next week or two about the pivot, whether it's real or not? I mean, I think we are so caught up in the military dimension. I don't know 50 years out what the U.S. presence is going to look like with China's continuing investment in military capabilities. But I will say that on the economic front, I think what's really important is for the United States to be robustly engaged and to be rebalancing not just from a security perspective, but also in terms of the economic thing. And I think the administration has had this spot on in looking at the TTIP and Trans-Pacific Partnership has been exactly the right instinct. What's been a little frustrating to me is that the president's own party can't decide that it wants to get behind him in this and has undermined him, I think, very, very much in his administration when it's gone abroad because they aren't willing to give him fast-track authority, and I think that's made it really difficult. The second thing I'd say about the pivot that's interesting is we are kind of having a strategy panel. I think there's a tension here between, Benghazi, which was a tragic but sort of discrete event in a place of great instability, and then Ukraine. So these are sort of flashing events, and people always say at the NSC is, well, it's so hard to do strategic thinking and strategic planning because of your inbox. Well, here is a situation where the administration looked at long-term trends and I think said, what is the world going to look like in 25, 30 years? How do we position ourselves out of these quagmires that we've been in that the American people are frankly sick of, Sunnis and Shiites and that whole thing, and how do we position ourselves in the future? And then they get sort of hammered by the think tank community for not responding in certain events. So I think there's a real tension there. And I know, Barry, you worked at that quite a bit. I don't know if I'm off on this, but that's my kind of thinking about the pivot, that it's sometimes a little unfair that some of the critiques that the policy community here has of the vision and implementation.
Yeah, Barry, maybe just a response, and then we'll kick out some questions to the audience.
Sure. I mean, look, I've helped write some of these strategic documents, and I've read the January 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, which was the first official enunciation, at least in a defense document, of the pivot to Asia. And I do think it was overplayed, and I have the sense almost, because I used to be one of the bureaucrats, I mean, I had the sense that they did some great work internally. They did some great work to deal with a reduced budget environment. And they said, they just kept going. They said, this is so great, let's just put all this out. And I think the strategic articulation was not, I'll just use the technical sense of the term, was not diplomatic. When an administration makes official statements, even nuances sort of get very carefully parsed. I used to help write the national security strategies, and after these were published, I'd have embassies coming into me, okay, you changed the word about NATO. Does this mean it's more conditional acceptance of NATO? And in some cases, they were right. But so I think that we have to be really careful with this kind of language. And I do think one of the greatest sort of security challenges for the next several generations, if we want to really do as much as possible to reduce the threats to us and to our allies, we have to help integrate the greater Middle East into the international economic order, which is a tall order. But so were a lot of other previous tall orders. But that will do at least as much as pivoting to Asia for reducing the threats to the growing international space that is the international economic and security order. I think this is a generational challenge, and we should be clear about it. It's at least as much of a challenge as the Asian challenges that are coming. And so that's why I think it was a bit inarticulate and a bit too much of a stark prioritization for a world, as the president said today, when someone asked him about the Korean threat, we have to be. We don't have the luxury of choosing which thing we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to deal with a lot of things at once. That's why I think that's sort of my bottom line take on the pivot.
Mm-hmm. Well, some good thoughts there all around. I was hoping to ask some questions to the audience. Let's start it off with our wonderful introductory host, Steve. If you could introduce yourself and ask a question again.
Thank you. I'm Steve Grundlin, the Lund Fellow here at the Atlanta Council. I would like to get right back to the sartorial stylings of the defense strategy with the following question. Is there a military capability that we can imagine, but just haven't invested in, or that we ought to start imagining, which if it was available to the commander-in-chief, would change our posture toward Aleppo, Crimea? Because this is where I'm coming from, which is the strategy fails to motivate. Right? That's what a strategy does in the bureaucracy. It makes us think about things and act on things and invest in things that we might not otherwise do. And with respect to, let's again caption it in Aleppo and Crimea, I have the sense that this is some part our posture toward these crises is some part a matter of will, but it's also some part a matter of no tools. I gotta believe the president wishes he had more nuanced, more something tools with which to affect what's going on there than he does. And if he doesn't, then we ought to have and we think this is emblematic, representative of the sort of crises that do have consequence for the national security of the United States out into the rest of the 21st century, then we ought to have a strategy that induces us to create capabilities that are responsive to a commander-in-chief that wants to affect them, but doesn't have any tools with which to do it. So,
Your question.
Is the defense strategy naked in respect to the fact that it's not cultivating capabilities that are responsive to what a commander-in-chief needs for these kinds of situations?
Jeff, do you want to take that one?
That's a really interesting question, particularly in the idea. I'm almost imagining sort of some, capability that like no one's ever thought of or heard of. What could you do to neutralize these situations? And I think but I think if you look at the Syria and Ukraine thing, they're different, right? And I think you get back to that question of will. On Ukraine, if you're the president and you start thinking military options, in my view, you better sit there and say, am I really ready to take this all the way to nuclear? And if you cannot say yes to that, then you take all military options off the table. That's how I look at Crimea I see he has a response.
But let's remember, somewhere in the early part of the 20th century, it's asking this question that developed the tank, right? Where we said, we need a thing that can respond to this kind of an insecurity problem. In other words, I'm kind of responding to the sarcasm to which you first responded to my question, which is, well, why should we fantasize about these things? And I'm saying because that's how we develop new capabilities.
Stacy is someone who's talked about and studied military posture a lot. Would you like to respond?
Oh, I was just going to say that I don't think innovation always works in such a direct fashion, because what you intend the innovation to be used for is often very different from how it is employed. So if you look at stealth and precision, which completely revolutionized warfare and was intended to be used against the Soviets on the Central Front, and what it has actually done was lower the costs of warfare for the United States, that it could have all of these options to get involved in Bosnia and Kosovo without causing too large of collateral damage or risking too many American assets. So, I have trouble envisioning what type of capability, maybe a hypersonic weapon that you could strike from distance, but I'm not sure that really solves the problem of paramilitary forces in Crimea, where you need something probably, you're facing a lot of threats that are actually kind of on the lower end of the spectrum in Asia and the East and South China Seas, and sort of a similar type of tactic's been used by Putin, and it might not be a technological solution to that.
Well, I want to make sure we get some other questions in. The gentleman with the nice cerulean blue sweater in the front.
Speaking of Sartorius.
Yeah, I'm not naked. This is one of the better panels, and Steve, would you please pass on to George? This is really a terrific idea. We need to do more of this. Two observations and a question. First, until Barry's last intervention, nobody mentioned NATO. This is the Atlantic Council, and I just raised that. Second, don't ignore history. Back in my youth in 1958, we were pretty close to war with China, I thought, over Quemoy and Matsu. In 1971 or 72, you will recall when we finally signed the agreement with Japan, if you read the headlines in the Socialist Republic of Cambridge, where I was at graduate school, everybody was worried about, were you going to go to war over the Sangatu Ratu Islands? And that was almost 40 years ago. And Jeff, Eisenhower was not a bubble, it was Jack Kennedy. Kennedy doubled the size of our nuclear forces in the first 3 months in office, which was a contributor ultimately to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you might just want to go back and review that part of history. I think Kennedy was the one who really caused the bubble, both in stressing of conventional forces, flexible response, and so forth. My question is this. Are you all living, and I would just exclude Barry from this, but he's welcome to answer, are you all living in a bubble? When I consult my nieces and nephews and friends of mine, children who were in graduate school, they don't really care about this stuff. Right now, if you believe the opinion polls, and there are a dime a dozen, 2/3 of Americans say we don't care about Ukraine and we should not send more forces to NATO. We've really had enough. Washington Post headline front page today, 64,000 bridges, including the Key Bridge, are falling down. So my question is, when you get outside the Washington bubble and people who really love this stuff, what do you think your contemporaries in Pittsburgh or in Silicon Valley or Midland, Texas, are really thinking about this? And do you see a bigger gap in your own experiences, between 20 or 30 years ago when we had a real threat and today. So in other words, our people who are really focused on defense and foreign policy a very, very small minority and really not connected to the larger population of people, let's say, 35 or younger.
Well, I'd love to take that really quick and then send it to Zach. I was incredibly struck by the turn of events that happened last year when President Obama asked for authorization for use of force in Syria. And just as someone who covers the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the members there who were just flooded by phone calls from their constituents. And I don't know if you could call this, it's certainly not apathy. Some people might allege that it's low information, but it wasn't that they didn't care. They didn't want their lawmakers to commit them to another entanglement in the Middle East. And it was the most powerful message that I think a lot of these lawmakers who deal in foreign policy and usually have their views and criticisms of the administration practically ignored mostly all the time. This was an issue that was electric, and it resulted in that really surprising amount of opposition that there was to the intervention, which made the administration completely back off from it. Zach, what's your sense of it? And the question being, is there a disconnect between people who are interested in the foreign policy space in Washington, D.C., and Americans in general?
The so-called younger generation, old guys like us, we're over the hills.
Well, I mean, I would say actually that there's definitely a disconnect, but that's, there's always kind of been a disconnect. I feel, I wasn't born then, but I think when you look back, Americans just generally, the average American really doesn't really care that much about overseas affairs. And I think the crucial thing is that, right now, we just got done with the Iraq War and Afghanistan War. If you look back, after the Korean War, after the Vietnam War, American people were not interested in intervening largely in other places then either. And then I also think that the recession, whenever economic times are bad, they don't want to spend money abroad. So I think if the economy gets back rolling, wages start increasing or whatever, I think usually American people start to give the elites or whatever in Washington a freer hand. So I think, it's definitely, there's a disconnect, you're right, and I think that but I'm not too worried about it because I think it's happened before and we'll overcome it.
I was hoping we could go to Zach or Alex with a question back.
Hi, there's actually a Twitter question that we're tweeting, of course, at hashtag AC Strategy, and you're, of course, all tweeting to at AC Scowcroft. The question actually has to do with this, which is, do people care, especially when they're mostly focusing on domestic issues? That the economy is doing poorly. So the question is, how should we do strategy abroad when people really want a strategy at home?
Who wants to take that? Jeff?
Well, I think you can tie the two together. And by the way, I have the luxury of knowing Harlan Ullman's nephew, so I'm going to verify that after the panel. he was an intern of mine in 2008. Brendan was fantastic, so I'll verify that later. But I do take the point very well that this is tricky, and I'm from the Chicago suburbs and have a lot of family in Kansas and go to Indiana a lot. And you do get this very much, why are we involved in these Middle East wars? And it's basically, why don't you just, you hear things like, why don't we just let them kill each other? And these kinds of things, it's just very sort of, this is not our problem anymore. And I think that is why the Syria thing turned out the way that it did. And I think that it's hard to blame the president for not getting out in front of the American people there. But I will say there is a time where I think that on that question, the president can get out and lead. And it is when the stakes are right. When the stakes are right, and I think Woodrow Wilson saw this, and we saw this before World War II, you have to sort of help lead the American public in that particular way. I think on Alex's question it's a tricky one. This is why I think the trade pacts are important, and this is really an uphill battle because there's some interesting research on did NAFTA end up being a good thing or a bad thing, so there's not a lot of favoritism for trade, but I thought President Obama had a line a few years ago, I wish he had run with a little bit harder, which is winning the future. And I thought that this could have been something that he could have tied domestic policy of our own economic recovery to the pivot to Asia and to these trade pacts as well, that we can win the future by going abroad. There's an interesting debate going on right now in the Republican Party that I think is fascinating about will the U.S. engage in the long-term reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank? And this is viewed by the Tea Party as corporate welfare, and it's viewed by a lot of businesses, both small and large, as really helping them compete overseas in a very competitive export market with countries that provide a lot of support for that. And I think there are plenty of interesting linkages to our own domestic politics and what will enable us to succeed overseas, and I think it's up to our leadership to connect those two, to bring relevance to our foreign policy, to our economic recovery at home.
The woman in the second row.
Diana Negroponte from the Brookings Institution. I want to follow up on Jeff Lightfoot's use of trade and economic tools with regard to the EU offer of the Eastern Partnership to Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and countries which rejected it, but not backing it up with any hard power. So what in the end is the use, and do we wish to engage more often on trade offers with little hard power behind?
Somebody interested in tackling that? Barry, you're taking it.
I'm just not sure what that means. I mean, I think we have a range.
We had the offer of the Eastern Partnership,
Yeah.
which was thank you very much, thank you. Which was subscribed to enthusiastically by certain of the Central European countries, and which others rejected outright, like Belarus. But when push came to shove, the Eastern Partnership turned out to be hollow, as we saw in Ukraine. So what is the value then of these economic outreaches if we're not prepared to put some grit behind it? You can call it military, you can call it sanctions, you can call it whatever way. What's the value of these gestures?
Do you accept the idea that you?
It'd be interesting to ask. I'm not Georgian or Moldovan, but it would be interesting to see, if they agree with your assessment that these things aren't really viable or aren't worth pursuing. I think that the White House has taken great care. When the Georgians and Moldovans have come here, they've spoken here at the Atlantic Council, by the way, and then the president has made time out of his schedule, which I'm sure he probably never would for the Moldovan prime minister, but now he feel this is really worth him doing, and they want to give a lot of political high-profile backing to that. Can you match that with military means? Well, that's difficult, but I think, in other words, you could offer a membership action plan to Georgia, I guess, but that isn't really worth all that much either, and push comes to shove, as we saw with the Bucharest guarantees in 2007 and what happened to Georgia, or 2008 and what happened to Georgia shortly thereafter. I think but I think it's important that the European Union be in the game, and if the European Union has a whole lot of other tools that it can use because of its economic influence with Russia, if it chooses that this is a very big priority, then I think it can make it one, and I think that's their choice, and unfortunately it's not Washington's.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Walter Statler, National Defense University Foundation. I'd like to come back to the crisis du jour, which is, of course, Ukraine. The president said pretty quickly when this crisis developed that there were certain options that he would not use, and that is basically the use of force. So he broadcast that, and I think it gave an edge, of course, to Putin and others who wanted to take advantage of it. It probably made sense, but there is another option, and that is to say nothing. And I think, generally speaking, in some of these recent weeks, the president has provided too much detail in a way. For example, when saying that we were going to do joint maneuvers with Poland and the Baltic states and whatnot, emphasized that they were going to be small maneuvers and whatnot. And I think that has had the effect of emboldening those who were possibly interested in upping the ante and whatnot. And I'm not sure how you really cope with that type of situation, because we've already stated publicly that those options are really out. How do we really cope with this situation right now? Because it means that you can test the waters, use gradually increasing effective means and whatnot, and that there, in all likelihood, is not going to be very much that we are going to be able to do about that.
Mm-hmm. I've certainly heard that same critique from former brass about the level of detail that the administration has gone into to assure that it's not taking a maximalist position in standing up to Putin. Although it is interesting to think back of to compare and contrast of the Bush administration's response to Georgia and this administration's response to the Ukraine crisis. Arguably, the Obama administration has taken more steps, but you could also argue that Ukraine is more of a national security priority for the United States in general. Did anyone want to respond?
I think you're completely right. this happened time and time again, especially with this administration. We saw this with this is the Syria red line to a point. We gave a very crisp detail, and then we didn't want to follow through. And I think there's like a degree of strategic ambiguity can be very helpful towards us. That's what Putin's been doing after all, and he seems to be working for him. I mean, he leaves it open what he's going to do with Ukraine, and then it turns out when conditions are right, he annexes it. And so I think we should use strategic ambiguity. I don't think we need to always state so clearly what we're going to do, because that helps our adversaries plan better on their end.
And it's possible, I wonder what you think about this, Barry, if that is an administration strategy to reassure a sort of war-weary nation, in the sense of, are we about to get dragged into another crisis? Do you think that's behind the messaging, or is it a sincere desire to not escalate the crisis for fear that if you left that kind of strategic ambiguity strategy play out, it might give adversarial nations the wrong message?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between your policy and what you say in public, and I strongly agree with the question, which is, taking that off the table, announcing that we're taking that off the table is anti-strategic. I mean, not everything over 50. Not everything over 50 is bad, and during the Cold War, there was the development of classical deterrence theory, and Thomas Schelling, who came up with a lot of the deterrence thinking, said at one point, what's really important is the threat that leaves something to chance. And I think by taking the military off the table and knowing how the U.S. system works, and looking at the track record of the Obama administration, it did embolden Putin, there's no doubt. I would have much rather even if we decided that internally, and there's very good reasons why we might decide that, I would definitely not have said that in public, because it makes Putin's job a lot easier. And the only other point I'd make is that, to some extent, each administration defines themselves in contrast to their predecessor, right? Especially when it's the other party. And I think this administration came in, and I was in the White House when they came in many ways sort of defining themselves in opposition to sort of what one could call a relatively trigger-happy Bush administration before them. And so, the Obama doctrine and the rhetoric and a lot of important actions, which I agree with, were getting out of wars. And I think in most cases, with some small exceptions, I think that's a legitimate and very appropriate policy to follow regarding the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. But look, that doesn't mean that force shouldn't be used when needed, and I think they've perhaps swung too far in the direction of not using force and of not effectively wielding force in their public pronouncements and in other aspects, and in other, when you deploy force, there's no need to say that there's 17 people going to this square block right here. I think leaving a few things to chance and not being as clear is an important part of strategic policy going forward in a world that's much more complex, I think. Mm-hmm. So it's even more important to be more careful about how we weigh in with what and how we package things.
Mm-hmm. Stacey?
I completely agree about the strategic ambiguity, and I think that too much detail can be self-defeating, but at the same time, there is a little bit of a risk today, especially when it comes to deploying forces, because some of the factors we've talked about, almost everybody has a smartphone, everyone can go on the internet, or most people can, and therefore, if we oversell what we're doing, then we could be exposed, and it's like, oh, it's 4 companies of paratroopers from Italy, that's it, instead of it making it seem like it's something much more dramatic and substantial than that.
Jeff?
Because we had a comment about not talking enough about NATO, and I think I don't think there's a good military option or any viable military option for stopping Putin in eastern Ukraine or anything like that, but I do think there is, and we need to explore a little bit more fully the military options to reassure NATO. And here I think there's been a lot of caution from what we will or will not sell to certain countries in Central and Eastern Europe, or how we will support throughout the administration because of a desire to focus on developing relations with Russia, not provoke Russia. And I think even in this crisis still there's a desire not to escalate. And I think it's time for us to, as an alliance, to say, well, what do we see? Let's have a serious discussion about what we see as the threat and what are the steps that we need to take to provide reassurance focus on interoperability. Do we need to revisit some of our force posture assumptions? And the idea of provoking, we should not look to provoke Russia, but we should look to reassure our allies. And if Moscow and if Putin and his propaganda machine want to make that into a provocation, then they're going to do that. I think we need to do what's right for our alliance, and that should be our next step. I think the 600 troops is a start, but I don't think that's enough.
The gentleman with the red tie.
Thank you very much. Name is Ali Dodd Mafineza. Thanks a lot. Name is Ali Dodd Mafineza. My question has to do with the way you see the role of non-governmental entities, including the private sector, in the making of American foreign policy and strategy. Because it seems the focus has been on the White House and the current administration, which is, as most people would agree, rather insular in its approach to others, and most of the advisors of the president being people who helped him get elected, and that's why they are in these senior foreign policy positions right now. But the question is, how do you see the role of non-governmental entities, universities, think tanks, and to what extent do you think they can be proactive in pushing whoever the current administrationer might be? Thank you.
There are a lot of interesting issues where I think non-governmental actors can have a big role. I think Middle East is one area where that's especially the case. Stacey, do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
I mean, clearly that's one of the most challenging aspects of the security environment as we look to the future, is dealing with threats that are not states, whether it's terrorist organizations or the use of these sort of in-between undefined forces, paramilitary forces in Ukraine, or the Coast Guard type vessels or fishing vessels the Chinese like to employ in the South China Sea. So as far as think tanks, being employed at one, I do hope that they can have some influence on policy and can try to nudge in the right direction. And economic interests and corporations obviously have a role to play because the administration and the U.S. government is vested and wants the U.S. economy to thrive. But I think it all is somewhat indirect.
I think that's a really interesting question, and we're having a conference here on the 14th that's going to look at a lot of the implications of what I think was the premise of the question, which is, to me, we live in what I call a Westphalian plus world now, where nation states aren't going away, but they're joined on the international stage by very powerful individuals and groups who can do a lot of great things, and they are doing a lot of great things, but they can also do a lot of bad things. And they now and increasingly will have new capabilities in biotech, in manufacturing, in communications, in organizing, and I can go on, to have really important effects on the international, or what we should probably now call the global stage. But our government apparatus will soon be 70 years old. And I think the world's changed even a teensy bit since the 1947 National Security Act, and even as the act was amended by various other reforms. I think if we don't start making changes, and I don't want to sound like Chicken Little here, but if we don't start recognizing the people-centric aspects of the non-state actor aspects of what's going on in the world and the strategies we develop to deal with it, then we're going to face some serious damage to our interests. Cyber is the most obvious example. This is a private sector-run domain. Why wouldn't we ask the private sector to start developing cyber strategies related to our prosperity and our security, and bring the government in, at the appropriate time, instead of the government developing cyber strategies and then they consult with a group that has private sector individuals towards the end and say, what do you guys think of this? So that's for cyber. There's for energy, which is now a major security issue. Technology, which is increasingly changing our world, and we could go on and on and on. So in my view, again, the world has changed already, and we haven't come close to coming to grips with how we need to deal with it.
There's a woman with a question back here.
Yeah, what I want to ask is directly related to this, because I thought your comment in the beginning was really interesting.
Could you introduce yourself?
I'm Pia Bungarten, Ebert Foundation here in Washington. You said that we have to let go of the World War II framework and adjust to an era that we're already in. And you just laid out a little bit more what you mean by this. The world has changed so often since 1945. It's almost 70 years since the end of World War II, and we had the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, we had 9/11, and that's why I think I understand what you're saying, but it would be very helpful if you could talk a little bit more about how much the World War II framework still affects the way in which foreign policy thinking is done.
Barry?
I mean, I'll be very brief. I want to get to other panelists, but I mean, I was, in the U.S. government for almost 17 years, and we only really look at other nations, and we only really talk to other nations. And when we talk to non-nation states, we think of it as extracurricular. That's a nice thing to do. Let's go meet with that group, or let's go consult with that group. When the projections over the next 18 years are, there are two main factors that I see driving this new world of individual power, or what we call individual empowerment. One is the growth of the global middle class. For the first time in human history, the projections are by 2030 that 5/8 of the world's population will be in the middle class. More people in the middle class than the lower classes for the first time in human history. They will have voracious appetites for food, for water, for energy, for other natural resources, creating enormous new demands, enormous new opportunities because of technology, but enormous new tensions as well. And they will also have what some people have called envy. In other words, they now can see what's going on, they see what other people have, and they want prosperity, they want dignity, they want security. And when they don't have those things, they're going to make new demands on governments that do not have the capacity to respond for a lot of reasons. Governments ranging from the United States to Pakistan to what have you. And so that's sort of one big driver. The other are all these technology changes that are going on and really being driven by Silicon Valley that Washington's largely not aware of. These include not just cyber, but an enormous range of new biological capabilities where we can now write the code for new organisms. A revolution in manufacturing that's going on or starting to go on that's really driven by additive manufacturing, what some people call 3D printing or 4D printing. We have an issue brief coming out soon called the democratization of space, which is talking about now how individuals can develop space assets and use space assets for their own purposes. And so there's such a wide range of new capabilities for individuals, but we haven't changed our outlook, our strategies, how we develop policy, how we talk about it. We haven't changed any of that yet to deal with this new world, which we're seeing the manifestations of in places like Ukraine, in Syria, in Venezuela, and elsewhere. So we have to really start to change even the way we think about what's going on in the world, but also how we respond to it and how we structure our own thinking.
Well, I think that pretty much has us wrapping up. I really want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event and all the panelists for attending. And thank you all for coming.